It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Well, hello there. Welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show. It's me, Douglas Coleman. How are ya? Thank you for joining us. Nice to have you with us. I think things are finally starting to get back to normal. I just saw in the news that they're going to slowly be reopening the casinos in Las Vegas, which basically anybody who's ever been to Las Vegas, without casinos, there is no Las Vegas. There's just nothing else here. So it's going to be interesting to see when they're talking about plastic partitions between players and at the card tables and between the players and the dealers. And, you know, I don't know how they're going to do with the cards because people have to touch the cards. They're going to make people wear plastic gloves, which won't do any good. I don't know. It's it's going to be a challenge for sure. At least if things start to open up again, life will get back to somewhat of a normal, or the new normal, as they're saying. Oh, anyways, I think for the most of us, we are just sick of being locked down and everything closed, and time to get back to work. With that, we've got two guests today. The first one up is Shane Belcourt. Shane is an award-winning and two-time CSA-nominated filmmaker based in Toronto, Canada. His new film is called Red Rover, which I really liked. You can check it out at redrovermovie.ca. We get into an interesting conversation about movie making and filmmaking and comedy, all kinds of good stuff. He will be followed by Danny Dorling. Danny is a professor at the University of Oxford. He's a professor of geography, and he's written a new book called Slow Down, and we will talk about his book. I won't say anything about it. We'll just let you listen to the interview, and then you'll understand what the book is about. So lots to get to. We will be right back with Shane Belcourt.
Hurry, Bullwinkle! The show's about to start!
I'm coming as fast as I can.
And now...
Hey, Rocky, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Again?
Nothing up my sleeve. Presto! Ooh, don't know my own strength.
Now here's something we hope you'll really like.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Shane Belcourt. Hey, Shane, how are you?
Very good, Douglas. Thanks for having me on today.
Oh, thank you for coming on the show. As I mentioned just before we got going, I just finished watching your film, Red Rover. Very nice film, really good. I know there's always a trick to talking about films without spoiler, but I don't know that there's a huge spoiler in this film. I think we can kind of talk around it. You know, it's a great story. It's different, and I did get a real laugh out of that cardboard command module thing, because I had one of those when I was a kid. I built one with my father. I was like 7 years old. Yeah, I was like 7 years old, and it was the Apollo 11. That was the big summer of '69, you know, we were going to the moon. And my dad helped me build one out of cardboard, and I mean, it just took me back. It was so funny. So to see, you know, a grown man building one was really funny. Who came up with that idea to build the cardboard thing? Was that you? Because I know you were writer on this, or co-writer, yeah?
Yes, that's right. So I co-wrote Red Rover with Dwayne Murray. He's a friend I've known since grade 9 in high school. We've always shared the same, you know, bizarre sense of humor. And we love sort of creating film and TV projects, mostly up here in Canada together. And so with this one, writing the script, we, in particular with the pod, we knew we had to get him active. Okay, first of all, the conceit of the film is that it's a super low budget film, only $50,000 to make the film. So Canadian of all things. So it was very low budget, and that meant we sort of were limited with how many sort of extravagant pieces we could do. And but one thing we thought would be great for the character is to see him actively engaged in some physical way to pursue the dream of going to Mars, to colonize Mars, and his own personal training. And the one beautiful thing about a lot of the space agencies in the planet, definitely NASA, is so much of their materials are just there. You just get, it's a huge reservoir of data. You got to go through it, but you can find all kinds of things. And I'm sure that was the case in 1969. We found like these blueprints, for these space pods, and we thought, this is incredible that it's just all there. And that was just part of our overall research for the script. And then when we saw that, we thought, well, we have to do that. And it was Dwayne's idea specifically to have the character Damon building the pod inside the basement in his apartment. And I remember when David Hannon, who's the production designer for the film, he asked, well, what's the total budget of the movie? I'm like, $50,000. He's like, oh, okay. So you want me to do your art department budget by going to dumpsters around the city. Thanks a lot, buddy. But he did it. He went to the dumpsters and he pulled out, like, as he says, for that pod, those are just recycled cardboard boxes, old pieces of wood that he found out from shipping centers in the back garbage. And then he stole some of his kids' toys that they, in the big Lego collection that they wouldn't miss. And he just sort of built out of that. So, hats off to David Hannon and Dwayne for having the idea of putting that in the script.
Well, he did a hell of a job. In fact, it looked a lot better than the one that my father and I built. Back in those days, we didn't have the internet. And I remember that our blueprint was actually from Life magazine. There were pictures of the command module in Life magazine, and we said, okay, we can kind of do that. But I mean, it's 7 years old. I had this thing sitting in my room. It was very cool for a little kid. All stinking of spray paint, and it was.
I mean, that's you're lucky if you get a tent. Get a little fort. You and your father building that together. What a great memory.
Yeah. So that kind of brought that back. I got to ask, excuse my ignorance, but what is CSA?
The Canadian Space Agency.
Oh, all right. So that's your equivalent of NASA.
Oh, excuse me. You're talking about my bio.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Everybody likes to have the same acronyms, and then they.
I know. Yeah.
That okay. So my bio, yeah. So we have in Canada we have the Canadian Screen Awards.
Screen Awards. Okay.
So they're
all right.
Correct. Yeah. So for programs that were produced and aired in Canada, be them TV series or movies.
Okay. Oh, it's either for film or TV?
Correct, yeah. It covers both categories. It's like Emmys and Oscars all in one.
And Emmys and Oscars all at one time. Okay. No, because I looked it up just a few minutes ago, and it came up with one called Canadian Standards Association, which sounds like somebody that goes around measuring the accuracy of gas pumps, making sure they're distributing the, exactly 1 liter or 1 gallon of gas. So I thought, well, then that can't be it.
Maybe it's good that it is that critic. I am in the receiver of 2 CSA awards, and you can take that any way you want. I've won awards for the Space Agency, for measuring gas, as you outlined, whatever you need.
So I got to commend you on $50,000 to make that film, because it does not look like a low-budget film, quote unquote. People, I've interviewed many now independent filmmakers, and I know technology has helped tremendously in making it much cheaper to do a really good film. But $50,000 is sort of at the low end of the low end, kind of, for making a film. And your film didn't seem to lack for anything. So really well done.
Well, thanks so much. It's part of it is, the low budget nature of things is just the difficulty in creating a world in the production department. Like, 'cause you're absolutely right. Technology has enabled us, even with our iPhones, to get, great photos in any kind of lighting situation. It's in our pocket, so, that definitely, with the DSLR revolution, you can film movies on your stills camera at home. That's been a boon for independent cinema, but you still need to create a world And that's what kind of sells the character in place. So again, hats off to David Hannon for sort of, the limited sets we had, my backyard, an empty apartment, which is it's Damon's basement apartment. It's just an empty apartment building, an empty apartment in Dwayne's building. So, David did a great job of developing, what those looks would be. But then, I live in Toronto. We're right by Lake Ontario, and, it's just this beautiful spot. So, suddenly just going out in that world, it's hey, I need a lake. Here's a lake. Beautiful. And we definitely lucked out in being able to sneak on to the CNE, which is a Canadian National Exhibit. So it's like a fair, a big county fair we have in Toronto every summer, although unfortunately not this summer. But we've had it for years and years. And to be able to have a small production crew that a small budget film has, there's a lot of sneaking and stealing. So you could go kind of create your world just by having these small, tiny cameras and just walking into a space and trying your best not to have anyone's face in focus for rights reasons, and then just film away. And kudos to the actors to always be like, we could never lock down a scene. There was always people, the city of Toronto was around all of our shots. So, we kudos to them for being dialed in enough not to let it distract them.
I've asked this question before to other filmmakers, indie filmmakers, and I'll ask you too. Since you did such a wonderful job with $50,000, say if you had $1 million or $5 million to make this film, how would you have done it any different, or would you have?
That's a fantastic question. Wow. I love it. Okay, so with $50,000, we have such a limited crew. And so by having more crew, you can execute things more often. And you have more time with more money. So our days were extremely rushed. So when I look at the film myself personally, I'm so thrilled by the performances. I think the story's charming and the actors sell it. So we got what we wanted on camera as best we could with the money we have. I think it's a watchable film. If somebody wants to give it a 6 out of 10 or a 7 or 8, I think that's fair in my mind. And, at the same time, if we had more time that money would provide, I could definitely see the scene. This might be a little too film chit chat, but I'm open to it. It's very much like, wide establishing shot, reverse shot, whether that's OTS or singles, over the shoulders or singles. And I would have loved to have more complicated blocking with lighting setups and camera movement. That would have been a lot of fun for some of the argument scenes, but there was just no time. And for some of the coverage, we had to have 2 cameras rolling at one time in order to make the day, because the actors could not go into overtime. They were union actors, so they had to leave at a certain time. So it's another opportunity where I'm like, that shot could have been a little bit better, if we had had a chance to get this other angle. But there was just not that possibility for all those reasons. And the final thing I'd say is that, Dwayne and I, when we wrote the script with the purpose of trying to capture this with $30,000. Now, we were over budget by $20,000, and then we went and found a private investor to make the $50,000 budget work. And I would definitely say that if you had told me that we had $5 million to make this film, we would have done a much better job, in my mind, looking back, at creating the Red Rover application world. We had ideas of it being, more people talking about it on the news, getting famous newscasters to, have their footage. It's on the TV as he walks by a bank of TVs at a TV store. Like all those kinds of things we think about in movies where they create the world as a real big thing that's happening. We just couldn't afford that with ours. So we had to go really, really small in those. So there's some things I definitely would have done differently for sure. But if there's one bonus, though, one thing I would never change for sure is how good the performances were. I think Kaha G and Christian Brun and all the cast were exceptional, and they were so generous and wonderful. And I mean, that's the movie. That's why you watch it, and kudos to them.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not sure that any more slick cinematography would have done anything to add to the story. I mean, it might have made it look a little more glossy. I'm not exactly sure how old you are, but do you remember the show SCTV? Being Canadian, I thought you might.
But my friend, absolutely. I am old enough to remember SCTV 100% from Hamilton, Ontario.
Perfect. Well, then you'll remember maybe there was one episode where Johnny LaRue goes out with a crane shot on Polynesian Town, and Guy Caballero is just livid because he spent so much money. So when you started talking about all these various shots, I thought of, Johnny LaRue in the crane shot. So if you'd had the $5 million, you could have had a couple crane shots, yeah?
That's precisely it. It's more just to make myself feel more like a director than anything else.
No, but I think there's something more to be said about making a film of that quality, of your quality, on a low budget. Because if you take a look at, let's just pick one out of the sky, like Batman or James Bond, where the budget's at $200 million, something like that. And, they have 2 pages of dialogue in the whole movie. And the rest of it is just all CGI. Well, it's great. I mean, I'm not knocking those films. I'm entertained by that as well. There's something to be said about a really solid story that I think is, I don't want to say it's getting lost because you can still find them, but they're not quite as mainstream as maybe they were. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I totally take your point that there's some big budget film things that, it's been around since Jaws, arguably, the idea of like the summer blockbuster or something that's for everybody, especially now with the sort of foreign receipts in the Chinese box office, where, having a film with very little dialogue and mostly almost like a Buster Keaton take on movie making, where it's a silent movie with just action sequences, everybody could watch it and enjoy it. And you don't need to have the language. And it's one reason why comedy has a really hard time traveling the world, as you read about and you hear about, because the jokes are so specific to language and timing, and it's really hard to get that nuance right as you get it dubbed or translated with subtitles. But at the same time, you're absolutely correct. There is a gap in sort of movie and content consumption that definitely series TV is filling. And so many, Netflix and HBO and what have you, there's all these great series that, like, I'm watching Ozark right now. And there might have been a day when Ozark was a $20 to $60 million feature film that I would have saw in a theater. But they don't, as we know, they don't make those anymore, or actually Netflix is starting to make some of the romantic comedies, one of my favorite genres when I was a young person coming up, like the Pretty Woman and anything Julia Roberts in that era. There's those movies are lacking. And so now there's this, at the same time, there's this beautiful moment where there's this way that everybody has access to making movies, on their computers, on their phones. And so you're not sort of controlled in the sense of, I can't afford to get film and get it processed and hire all the super experts to get things underway to have a film released. Now you can do so much with your computer. So there is this kind of weird thing where, I miss the days when you could count on, Sea of Love with Al Pacino and Aaron Burks, back in the day, just these movies that don't really exist anymore, but independent low budget or smaller budget films are starting to fill some of those gaps because we want those stories. We want all kinds of stories on the screen. And also there's the issue as well with low budget filmmaking, where groups of people that don't really have access or connections to the industry, be that in any country, Canada, United States, or even around the world, they have access to make content and films that we've never seen before. And so it's an exciting time, but I totally take your point that when it comes to the big Hollywood stuff, I wish there was more money spent on, I guess, Christopher Nolan films. He's the only one left.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you brought up a good point that actually Charlie Chaplin brought up probably over 100 years ago when silent was starting to go over to sound. And he was really adamantly protesting having the tramp speak because he said that the rest of the 9/10 of the non-English speaking world won't understand the film. He said with the tramp being silent, everybody can understand the humor. And he was right, and even as great as Chaplin was, I didn't find his talking films nearly as entertaining as his old silent tramp films because he wasn't a great talker. He didn't have a great voice. He didn't have projection. He didn't have that as a speaking actor. But as a visual, physical actor with no dialogue, he was brilliant. It was just very strange how somebody couldn't transition over to speak, I mean, we've had talking pictures since the 20s now, so it's not something that people are going to really have much of an affinity for. But the point, I suppose, the parallel point, perhaps, is that now that technology has enabled indie people to make films, I'm waiting to see something truly unique. And I'm starting to. There have been several films that I've seen that just had a really cool storyline, like yours, for example. The idea of going to Mars, I think that's a great way to, introduce a traditional story, a love story with the ex and this one, and she's got her new one and all that, which has been done. But then when you throw in something like, he's going to Mars, that just takes it to a whole different place. So, I think technology can work. It didn't in Chaplin's case. That's the irony, I suppose. Somebody that was so brilliant.
Yeah, it's interesting too. When I think about watching those old films, Buster Keaton, I got more into Buster Keaton, stuff. Just blew my mind.
He was the same thing, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when I think about them both, I think how much the voice of the character with the few text cards that came in the film, it was my voice in my head. I was more that character. Yeah, because it was. There was no words, and it is a fascinating, line where we said, no, we have to have, sync sound and the talkies, in cinema, where before we were completely invested in these characters. They were everybody. They had no accent. They didn't sound regional to any place. Right. It is a fascinating thing that's transpired. I still love watching them mostly because I just can't believe the choreograph between the camera and their stunts on the scene. I'm kind of like, it's like watching the, when people Evel Knievel stunts, like, oh my God, are you going to make this? I just can't believe it. It's so outstanding.
One, I suppose, notable exception to something that translated well into all different languages that people got was I Love Lucy. Because even though it was dialogue and it was American, it was sort of recognizable enough around the world. I know people that don't speak any English at all that can watch I Love Lucy even in English, and they get it. They laugh, they get it, they laugh at the right time. And they just, because there's a lot of visual stuff going on as well, but even just her crying or Ricky yelling, or they don't have to know every single word that they're saying, but they get it. And I thought that was one of the brilliant parts of that show, was the fact that it was kind of international. Americans got it, but so did the rest of the world. There are films that you simply cannot watch without subtitle if it's not in your language. Where it's a visual medium, I think it's good if you can try to get more of those elements into your film, where it sort of appeals to everybody. And that's your Hollywood thing. I think most people can watch a James Bond and not really care that he said, my name's Bond, James Bond. And if that's his only dialogue, everybody's going to get it.
What is interesting, now that we're talking, I love where we're going. This is very fun. This combo. Thank you for this. I was thinking as you were speaking, the interesting part is, but when we're talking about action films, that have this universal appeal, whether it's comic book superheroes or, I don't know, somebody with a gun, like a Rambo type character blowing stuff up. Yeah. In either extreme, though, what's fascinating with the I Love Lucy, going back further to, we were talking about Chaplin and Buster Keaton, is those were comedies with action segments or sequences in them, but they were definitely there. Eventually they would work towards some actual feeling moments, but like a comedy would in general, but there was definitely a lot of physical comedy when I think about I Love Lucy. Not that I've seen a lot, I'm no expert on I Love Lucy at all, but I think about that era of performance coming out of theater, which is definitely playing to the back of the room. so the reactions and the actions were very like this. The traditional sitcom of the era was very broad, very big, very exaggerated. So you could kind of even though there was dialogue, the gags of comedy were still very, like, people would choke on something or spit take on something as an extreme example.
Right.
But that sort of now with comedies, we don't want that, right? Like, if somebody feels like they're performing on a theater stage, we don't want that in front of our film camera. That, like, why are you playing to the audience? There is no audience. This is a real life moment. And the more real it feels, the more natural that you act it, you mumble, the whole thing of mumblecore films, and the more just sort of people chit-chatting is real. And those jokes are way, you're absolutely right, within subtitles, to read that and get the timing, it's an impossible thing to translate. It'd be fascinating to see, like, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to think of somebody who does action comedies where you don't even, like the Charlie Chaplin thing in today's world. And I forgot the gentleman's name. There's one huge action star from China who does those things.
Jackie Chan?
Everyone at home's yelling, I know, Jackie Chan, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, Jackie Chan. And, those kind of films are the only thing I can think of where someone's still trying to say, no, we can have a universal language of cinema and it could still be comedic, as opposed to just someone runs, car chase, explosion, which I also love. I'm not trying to say I don't, but it's now this is what I want to do. You've inspired me to think only now, how can I make a comedy that's very little dialogue?
Oh, well, great. And listen, if you need a voiceover actor or something, please keep me in mind. I can be the, you remember the movie The Warriors? And you remember there was that radio disc jockey that you only saw her mouth? And she was talking about all the various gangs and where they were going to pop up in New York City. I would love to play something like that. I think that would be just fun.
All right, done.
Shane, we do have to wrap this up. Thank you so much for coming on. This was great fun talking to you. Your film is called Red Rover. It's not brand new, right? It looks like this says came out 2018.
It started its festival run in 2018, but it's now just got released on May 12th in the United States and Canada on video on demand.
Oh, super. How's it doing?
It's doing great. We're really thrilled with the response we've been getting. We've received a lot of, we always felt that the film was something that if people just see it in sitting with a bag of popcorn and a soda or whatever, they're going to just have a good romp of a time and get a little something out of it in terms of, some of the themes and issues. And that's been proven correct. We have a lot of people on Twitter or, other means of social media just contacting us. And I bumped into your movie. I watched it with, my wife or whatever, my husband, and had a great night. Thank you. We laughed and cried and so I like entertaining movies. So it's very thrilling to hear.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, it is a great movie. I just, like I said, just watched it. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The film's called Red Rover. My guest is director and co-writer Shane Belcourt. One last question, and then I'll let you go. The fight scene between the two guys in the backyard, and when the main character, when he whips the other guy's shorts down, was that accidental or was that scripted like that? Because it looked like it just sort of happened accidentally.
It was, again, kudos to the actors on that particular fight sequence. That was written into the script. That was when I was in college. One of my housemates, he and I got into a stupid, silly argument. These things happen with your party and whatever else. And then he came at me. He's a big man. He could crush me in two. There's no doubt about that. But he was wearing track pants. So the only move I had was to dive, whip down his track pants, and run away as he tried to pull his pants up. So it was a survival instinct at the heat of the moment, and then I put it into a movie, and the actors nailed it.
Oh, well, it was funny as hell, and it's very typical because when real people fight, that's the kind of thing that happens. It's not like watching Mike Tyson. You know what I mean? It's in a whole different ballgame. When two guys go at it, it's often just silly stuff like that, or they pick up something that's in the room. I remember seeing a fight in a bar where the guy took the sugar container and threw the sugar in the guy's face, and that was his move, So, when you see stuff like that in film, it's just funny. But, okay, no, because it looked very spontaneous. I didn't know if that was just... like he just absolutely happened to grab his shorts and they came down or something. but very funny anyways. So Shane, thank you very much for coming on the show. The movie's called Red Rover. Check it out. Best of luck with the film. I hope it does really well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me today. I really had a great time, man. It was fun.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
Hi there, this is Stuart Epps, record producer. This is my story about Elton John, working with him in those early years, going back to 1967 at Dick James, all the amazing tours, those first recordings, going through to Rocket Records, and it's an amazing story about his incredible rise to stardom and my part in that. So look forward to taking you on that journey. So here we go. Yeah, and to order this great audio CD, please just email me at stuartepps@talk21.com. That's Stuart, S-T-U-A-R-T, Epps, E-P-P-S, at talk, T-A-L-K, 21 in figures.com. Stuart Epps at talk21.com. Email me and I'll give you all the details for buying this brilliant audio disc. Thank you. Bye.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Acclaimed author of Garden, Jane Yates brings you the first book in a new trilogy, Octopus Pirate, a story of a foundling who has unusual talents, such as the ability to communicate with octopuses. As a baby, he was washed up on an island off the Scottish mainland. An eccentric former nun who lives alone with cats brings him up. He joins a circus and narrowly escapes plots against him, flees to Cornwall, builds a replica pirate ship that's also an airship to travel back in time to fight real pirates. Get your copy today from Amazon, only 99 cents.
Tired of living in a culture of lies, fake news, and alternative facts? The Pro-Truth Pledge reverses the tide of lies by calling on politicians, and everyone else, to commit to truth-oriented behaviors. The pledge asks signees to commit to 12 behaviors that research in behavioral science shows lead to truthfulness, such as clarifying one's opinions and the facts, citing one's sources, and celebrating people who update their beliefs toward the truth. Private citizens who sign the pledge get the benefit of contributing to a more truth-oriented society. Public figures get more substantive rewards for signing the pledge in the form of positive media and public recognition. The pledge crowdsources the truth by asking volunteers to evaluate the statements of public figures who sign the pledge. Take the pledge, demand that your elected representatives do so, and encourage your friends to take it at protruthpledge.org.
Are you an independent musician? How would you like to have your songs played on hundreds of radio stations just like the one you're listening to right now? Join MusicSubmit.com and we'll promote your music to radio stations and blogs in your genre. It's free to set up your account, and we guarantee your music will be considered for airplay by radio stations worldwide. Why not sign up today? It's free. MusicSubmit.com. Radio promotion for indie musicians.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Danny Dorling. Hey, Danny, how are you?
I'm fine. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. Just to give people a little bit of background, could you just tell us basically what you do? And you've also got a book out called Slow Down, which I want to talk about. But just give us a quick backstory of your life, and then we'll go from there.
Oh, the whole life. It's not that exciting. When I was 18, I went to university and I studied mathematics, statistics, and geography at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. I'm now 52. That was when I was 18. I never left. I never left the university sector. I went and I did a PhD. I became a researcher. I became a university lecturer. Now I'm a professor at the University of Oxford, and I still look at geography, mathematics, and statistics. How are things changing? What can we tell about the world? I draw atlases. I draw lots of maps comparing countries, and I try and measure improvements or things getting worse, because we all know the world's unfair. What we're interested in is it getting better or worse? And that's what fascinates me. So I tend to look at change and change over places.
Well, there's certainly a lot of change taking place right at the moment, which I'll get to in a second. I did want to ask you, do you think that people who become professors just fall in love with the idea of being a student for the rest of their life?
I think it is often accidental. You have to have enjoyed it. You can't become a professor, it's obvious, but, you have to get high grades at university. So clearly you were enjoying it all the way through. But then there's an enormous amount of luck. Everything has to go right for you at every possible stage. And you can see this when you get older. So when you're going through it and you're young, you think, aren't I clever? Didn't I do well? I got that mark for that degree. I got this job. Whereas what actually happens is you're lucky. I didn't get ill at the wrong times to get ill. I was lucky with who I was. I didn't get divorced at the wrong times and so on. But anyway, a lot of people do try and be university professors, and I'm very fortunate that I've managed to do it. It's a lovely job to have. It's an interesting job, and it's varied in what it does. Not necessarily a safe job at the moment, because we're not quite sure where our students are going to come from next year. But it's still a job that's a privilege to have.
So you were a professor of geography. Did you read Jules Verne as a kid? Did you enjoy that sort of around the world in 80 days and traveling the world? Would that have been one of your dreams to do?
And going Jules Verne, going to the centre of the world. I wasn't very good at reading, but my father, used to read to me, and he read that one in particular. So yes, always interested in the idea of exploring maps in particular, and things being different elsewhere. How exciting is it? I can remember at the age of 6, we moved to a different part of town, and the first thing I did was to get on my little bike and cycle around the street and draw a map of my new neighbourhood so I could work out where I was. And that isn't normal, so clearly I was partly destined to do this, but I was also very lucky.
The coronavirus, which seems to be the center of attention for everybody at the moment, if you turn on any news outlet, that's all that they're talking about. There is really nothing else in the news, save for the coronavirus. And reading through your bio, you had mentioned that there could be a light at the end of this tunnel. The title of your book is called Slow Down. Other people have said that this is a reset moment for mankind, for society. Do you agree with that? Do you think that this is the form it's going to come in a pandemic?
It's possible. Now, I actually have a section in my book about pandemics, because they do matter if you're looking at change. And the default thing is that they don't change everything. Well, at least the recent ones have. So the big 1918-1919 flu pandemic, far, far worse than this, which actually originated in America. Just worth saying, Jim, when everybody sort of says it's terrible, this pandemic originated in China, I think America should realise the really biggie originated in America. That one was associated with a 14% drop in world GDP that year, but it bounced back to 16% the year after, and it was almost as if it had never happened. Now, we've had 3 others of these pandemics, these kind of quick up and down ones. And your listeners won't know when they were, but they all killed far more people when we had less people than this one. They're the 1951, 57, and 1968 flu pandemics. And none of them caused a reset. AIDS, which is a pandemic, didn't cause a reset. However, in no previous pandemic have we reacted in this way to it. And the other really important thing, I think, or hope, about why this one is different, is that all those previous flu pandemics, the world was accelerating economically at the time. It was going forward. A pandemic couldn't stop us. Whereas we were already slowing down when this one hit. We were already entering a global recession that was being predicted. We were already questioning how we lived. We already had climate change strikes of millions of children around the world protesting. So this one has come at a time when we are unsure of ourselves. And it partly explains why we reacted to it in the way we did, which is so different to how we reacted to pandemics in our parents' and grandparents' lifetime.
Well, why do you think there was such a panic for this one?
You're always drawing analogies if you're an academic or looking for something else. So the last time we had a panic like this with a disease was cholera. Cholera in the 1840s, 1850s, which came up from India and happened just by chance to come up through Russia and through the Russian court and killed quite a few aristocrats. And that gave cholera a particular reputation. So when cholera came to London, the powerful and the rich were absolutely petrified about it, even though, and they didn't know this, their chances were actually pretty low, and all they had to do was get out of London and they'd be fine. But they were so frightened of cholera, and it kept on coming back, and they didn't know about it. It was a new disease. One doctor in Oxford thought it was caused by when you got lightning without the sound of thunder, which sounds ridiculous, but you can imagine how scared they were. And they built sewer systems. It was a sea change. We changed the public health of Europe as a result of cholera. Now, this disease, in a way, initially was quite similar. It was business people. It was very well-off tourists coming to New York, coming to the Alps in Europe. It was politicians who got it. Famously, the Prime Minister of Britain got it. Showbiz people. So this wasn't a disease originally of the poor or somewhere else. Whenever that happens, I'm afraid to say we are very, very callous and we don't do anything. This was something which could affect us. And not only that, something that experts couldn't tell us about. They couldn't even say, does it kill 1 in 1,000 people or 1 in 100? That's a huge difference. That's 10 times more. They couldn't tell us will it come back. They couldn't tell us will it mutate. They can't tell us because we don't have a vaccine for the common cold, whether we actually will get a vaccine for this. And we're so used to people being able to tell us everything. So this is, I think it's understandable. My worry is that we worry about those things that we shouldn't worry about it. For instance, almost nobody under the age of 20, 25 suffers from this, and hardly any ever die from it. And, you know, that should be understood and known. People really shouldn't be worrying about their teenage children at all. But I can say it's easier for me to say this to you because even though I'm in England and we've had the worst outbreak in all of Europe, we are 2 to 3 weeks ahead of you. And so our news is still saturated with COVID. I'm afraid your news will be for 3 or 4 more weeks, absolutely saturated. But yesterday, we had the first report of the first day where for the whole of London, which is about 1/10 of our country, the whole of London, not a single case was reported. And that's quite incredible. So the disease does fall down almost as fast locally as it rises. And we could tell more people about the hope than the absolute rigid fear that there is out there. But it's very tricky. Also, finally, I should say on this, it has been 52 years since the 1968-69 pandemic. That's a long time. We've had a long time without a similar kind of pandemic in which to forget. So it's a shock. But other good news, that pandemic, it came back. It had a second peak in 1970 and a third peak in 1972. These second and third peaks happen when you're not looking. There is no way we're not going to be looking for this one. But we haven't even told people the second and third peaks, it's not about in a few weeks' time. It's about coming back in the autumn. It's about coming back next spring. That's what you have to worry about. So we need much more information being given out there, sharing between countries, and looking at the experiences of other countries. You know, when do they open up their schools? What do they do? What happened? We could do just geography, and I'm a geographer, but we really could learn much more in our news. If we're going to be obsessed by COVID, at least you could have a look at COVID in Belgium, COVID in France, COVID in Brazil. What are they doing? What works? Don't just look at it in your own country. And I'm afraid the UK is as guilty as the USA for endlessly reporting on what's happening, whereas we can, inside the country, whereas we can actually learn, particularly by looking at countries where it was worse 2 or 3 weeks ago in their country and seeing what changes.
I just saw on the news yesterday, I think, that South Korea is just opening up their schools. They had a very intense but isolated version of COVID. It seemed to be all located in one particular kind of religious cult in the south of the country. And they seem to have done a good job of isolating it. Their numbers are relatively low, I think, compared to other countries.
Tiny, just a few hundred.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, go on.
Well, this is part of the good news. So this is a disease that it is entirely possible to contain and reduce. South Korea, along with Japan and, of course, China and Taiwan and Vietnam, all had knowledge and memory of SARS far more recently, and of fear. And so people reacted very differently, not just the authorities, but everyday people reacted differently. And simply deciding you're not going to go to a concert, you're not going to go to the theatre, you're not going to go to a crowded situation, that and a tiny bit of social distancing will have a huge effect on the spread of a virus like this. The other thing worth saying is this really spreads in very, very crowded, dense cities with many, many connections. Hence why London has the worst rates in Europe. Hence why New York had the worst rates in the USA. And the last thing worth saying is it really does absolutely prey on the very elderly. In the UK, somebody aged 80 or over is, and I'll wait for it, 10,000 times more likely to die of this, 10,000 times than somebody aged 20 or older. So only countries with very large numbers of elderly people can actually produce large mortality rate numbers from this. If you're over 80, you really have to worry hugely. If you're my age, in your 50s, it increases my chance of dying this year by 25%. My chance wasn't very high anyway. It's 25% higher.
Do you think that this thing is going to get contained, or is it going to morph into a new strain? They're talking about that it looks different in the northern part of China towards the Russian border. They're reporting cases coming out of there that are having longer incubation periods in people. Did you see that news?
Yes, I mean, you got to remember, the listeners remember, I am just a geographer. I have written books on medical geography, and I have produced, well, it's called the Green Reaper's Atlas. We produced an atlas of all the deaths over 25 years in the UK. So I've looked at patterns of diseases, but I'm not a virologist, I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a medic. Most of what I know of COVID is the last few weeks. But these viruses do mutate. When they mutate, they tend to get less deadly. That's because it's in their, well, they don't think. A virus isn't actually alive, and it certainly isn't thinking. But a successful virus is one that's less deadly because it can spread more, hence the common cold. It's a very successful virus. A virus which has the mortality rate of this one, well, we run around trying to stop it. So it's not good news for the virus. So as it mutates, those strains which are less deadly are more likely to survive and beat those strains which are more. But we don't know. We're so impatient. This thing was only isolated, a matter of weeks ago? But what we can say, or you can look at precedent and you can say what does happen when you have other diseases which are new. It's all absorbing at the time of the disease. Nothing else matters, and you think it's going to be the end of the world. And then quite shortly afterwards, within a year, 2 years, that was something that you can remember, but you don't actually even remember the kind of fear that you had. I've talked to people older than me who can remember the 1968-69 flu, which 1 million people in the US died. 1 million people worldwide, and a very large number in the US. And they say, oh yes, there was that nice old, in this case, university, that nice old professor, he died. And that's all they can remember about it. So we don't know whether this will be prevalent and stay forever. We don't know. It could even burn out. We just don't know. But we will know fairly soon. I could tell you the other kind of thing we don't know about. People have asked me, will there be a baby boom because of people have been in lockdown? Will I have more babies 9 months later? And I just say to them, wait 9 months. We can't know. Just all we've got to do is wait to 9 months after this, and then we'll discover. I don't think people are going to have more babies because they're worried about their economics, their jobs, and so on. But there are things we can know about, and that's things that have happened a lot, and we've got lots of data and lots of experience about. And there are things where we should accept things that are completely new and have not occurred in this way before. We really ought to accept a degree of uncertainty. That isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's being sensible. And also, if you want to cheer people up a bit, as I said, this is much, much less deadly in terms of how many people it's killing than the pandemic of 1918, like dozens, hundreds of times less deadly. So this will wake us up and make us prepare, because one day there will be a worse pandemic in future. And clearly we were utterly unprepared even for this one. So the good news, possibly for you and I, and certainly for the generation below us, is that at least we'll learn the lessons of this one, and we will not be quite so laid back as we were in this case in future.
I think what people are going to remember more about this one, maybe not necessarily how many people died, because as you mentioned, far more people died in pandemics in the past. People are going to remember the reaction to it. Oh, I couldn't go out of my house for 3 months, and I couldn't go shopping, and we had to stand 6 feet apart. And I think people are going to remember that more, because we're so used to being free, particularly in the United States and in Europe. Free movement. You could just get on a train, you could get on a plane, and now it's really not possible. And I think people are going to remember that probably more. Yeah,
and they might remember, they could do, but also there's a big difference between the initial shock and after a few weeks of it, I'm now much more used to the idea that I'm lucky I've got a garden. I also now know I'm lucky to have a garden, by the way. People stuck in apartments, it's been terrible with children. The first few weeks for me, I'm so used to getting on planes and actually flying places. I really hated it. 6, 7, 8 weeks on, I'm getting more used to doing this, talking like this, not going into work. I really do want to see people again, but I don't crave it quite as much as I did, and I'd be quite happy to travel half as much next year than I travelled last year. That will be enough for me. And without this pandemic, I wouldn't have actually have realised I was doing far too much. I had to cancel 10 air flights I was supposed to be on. It was ridiculous because I was launching this book. I had a diary absolutely full of public lectures and talks I was doing in Britain, all cancelled. Now, I'd like to have done some of them, but I was doing too much, and other people might think that too when they look at what they were doing. They'll worry about finances and so on. But if you're having to do 2 or 3 jobs and also fit everything else in, maybe a slower future would be better for you as well.
Well, that's a perfect segue for your book, which you're here to promote, I assume. Your book is called Slow Down.
Talk about the book.
Slow Down, the end of
the book.
Oh, go on. We have a bit of a delay in this.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Quite funny. The minute you talk about slow down, the internet itself slows down as we're talking to each other.
Yeah.
Yes, so I should tell you about the book. I like talking in general. I spent 6 years working on this book, so for me it's been a long time. I was going to write a book about what's speeding up and what's slowing down, and then the surprising thing, why I think the book is worth reading, is that I could find hardly anything that was speeding up. Things that were still increasing, but not speeding up. And I also then looked at the slowing down, and I concluded it wasn't terrible. Now, the kind of thing that was slowing down, the amount of inventions we make, the peak decade of inventions in the 1930s, of inventions that really changed our lives, new uses of electricity. And we talk about inventions that are made nowadays, but they really don't alter our lives in the way that our parents and our grandparents' lives were altered. My grandparents were born at a time when there were no tractors in the fields. Horses were used to plough everywhere. And they can remember the tractors appearing and the cars, and they can remember the first air flight, as my grandparents could. And even, landing on the moon. It's an incredible change in their lifetime. My mum and dad could tell a similar story, whereas my story of technological change is much more boring. But not just technological change, economic growth. The 50s and 60s were the period of massive economic growth in the West. Population. By the 70s, our population was not growing as fast as it had done before for the first time in centuries, and then it slowed in the 80s and 90s, and it slowed every decade of this current century. So we tend to think things are speeding up. You measure it, you find they're slowing down, and I can very quickly tell you what's speeding up because it was hardly anything. The number of university students in the world was speeding up, not just rising, but rising faster each year. I say were, because now students don't want to fly around, it's going to reduce. Air flights, they weren't just going up every year, they're going up by more than a year before. Consumption of material goods by weight and carbon, we were doubling in 22 or 23 years the amount of stuff that we were consuming worldwide, despite our population numbers not doubling anymore. And that led to carbon pollution, and finally, temperature. Surface temperature of the planet wasn't just rising, it was accelerating. And that was it. Everything else that you might think was rising, big data and so on, was rising, but it wasn't rising ever faster. And many things were slowing, and some were going into reverse. So the populations of some countries are already falling. The populations of almost every country will be falling in 50 years' time, given the rate of change. Average heights of human beings falling. Life expectancy is still rising, but rising slower than ever before the pandemic. So as you can tell, I can go on and on about my book, but it's a book that we put it to bed in January this year, didn't change a word, that said it's all slowing and it will continue to slow. And the important thing about that is that's before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, without even knowing the pandemic was happening, you could say the future is not going to be about as fast a change as the past. And then the pandemic comes, and those 4 or 5 things that are still speeding up, bang, they slow down as well.
I guess the last question I want to ask, and then we've got to wrap it up. Do you think once this is finished, and I don't think it's going to just suddenly switch off like it did in China. I think it's going to taper out, fizzle out perhaps. Are we ever going to get back to the normal that we had prior to the pandemic? In other words, you had mentioned concerts and theaters and things. Are we ever going to go back to that? Or is that forever going to be altered in some way?
No, I think we'll definitely go back to that. We won't be living for decades and decades with 2 meters apart for us. We fear that, and it's good we fear it. Our worry helps us sort out problems. But no, we will work out how to isolate this. We will have flare-ups of it. We will have monitoring and surveillance. If we're lucky, we get a vaccine. If that's lucky, we have no vaccine against the cold. We've faced things like this before and solved them. Admittedly, sometimes it was difficult. With cholera, you did have to put an entire sewer system into towns that never had a sewer system before. But once you'd done that, you got rid of the risk of cholera. Human beings are very astute, but other things will have to change. We had got to a point where we were doing things which were ridiculous. Flying when we didn't need to fly. And whenever, and this isn't me being political about it, whenever you see something that is accelerating and rising faster and faster, you know it's going to have to stop. But this is the way in which we stop the rise in flights. What happens next is that quite a lot of airlines go bust. The cost of flying rises because if you're flying with fewer people, your fixed costs are still high. Lots of people will be very frightened of flying now. Flying is not dangerous because the plane might crash. Flying has always been dangerous because you're in the tube with many strangers sharing the same air.
Right.
That's always been a real risk of flying. So the kind of changes that I expect to happen is that flying will become what it was like when I was young. Something you might do once a year or not at all, and it was really exciting and a treat. Not something you would do routinely. That's the kind of change. I don't think that's a bad change. But the concerts, mixing and so on, as soon as you get to a situation where for a month you've not recorded any cases, you can begin to mix again, but you'll have to keep the surveillance up. But we're so frightened of this. This is the really good news. That to get a second or a third wave, as we got in 1968 or 1918, it requires you not to have surveillance, not to worry, not to be looking. And we're really, really going to be looking. So, I could be wrong, but I think we could have a very different conversation this time next year. But I hope we learn from it. I hope as the economy crashes, we work out a way of bringing the economy back up again, which doesn't involve us having to work as long hours as we were working in January this year. There were aspects of our life before the pandemic which were not aspects we should necessarily want to bring back.
Okay, well, we got to wrap this up. My guest is Danny Dorling, and his book is called Slow Down, The End of the Great Acceleration. It's out and about, available now, yeah?
It's out and about. You just Google me, Danny.Dorling, Dorling, and Slow Down, or University of Yale University Press. They published it. The book's called Slow Down. It's available now. I'd love it if people would read it. You may agree, disagree, but the key thing was I said all of this and put it down on paper before we knew the pandemic would happen. And so it's an objective look without being obsessed by what's happening now, but the direction in which change was happening anyway.
Great. Danny, thank you so much for coming on. This was very enlightening and enjoyable. Best of luck with the book. I hope it does very well.
Thanks ever so much for having me. I've loved talking.
Take care. Bye-bye.